How can you become a force multiplier in your work, in your personal life, in your relationships? My guest today, Tony Chatman, is going to explain what that means and how to be more than 1 + 1 = 2, but how to be 1 + 1 = 10. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about leadership. We really dive deep into a concept called unconscious bias, and it's fascinating, and we all experience it. So today is a deep dive with a really, really cool dude named Tony Chatman. Tony turns problems into progress as a corporate relationship expert. Tony addresses the dysfunction that burns out executives, frustrates staff, and ultimately stalls success. His strategies for understanding people and processes enable organizations to achieve their goals through listening and leadership. His clients have included the U.S. Secret Service, J.P. Morgan Chase, Estee Lauder, Clear Channel, Bermuda Ministry of Education, and the National Training Conference for Blacks in Government. Tony is the author of The Force Multiplier, which I actually just read this past weekend. We're going to talk about that today because it's a great book on leadership, and it's written a little differently than maybe some of the leadership books you've read in the past. So with that being said, Tony, welcome to the ThriveMore Show.
Thanks for having me, Roger.
Tony, I'm excited to dive in today because your background as a corporate relationship expert is going to provide a lot of value to listeners, but your path to get there was not maybe the normal path that someone may take, getting into a consultancy practice and whatnot. So can you talk about your background and how it varied from the normal path?
Sure. So I started off as a chemical engineer, which most people would never guess when they look at me or hear me or see me on stage. Like, you do not fit the mold of a chemical engineer, right?
Sure.
But very quickly, what I figured out was, although school had trained me very well for the product and the process side, it was lacking on the people side. And I quickly figured out that the people side would either be my competitive advantage or my Achilles heel. And so then as I started moving into different leadership roles, I made it my aim to learn people the same way I learned chemical engineering, and just to really study it, figure it out, understand the art and the science behind it. And so then as I moved from being a chemical engineer to my wife and I jumping into faith-based nonprofit and doing that space, in which I really, jumped in my leadership roles, I started having mentors who would tell me things like, you have to remember that for most people, leadership is not natural. It is a learned thing, which was really helpful for me because I clearly was not a born leader. I figured that out quickly. But the other thing they told me was, you have to lead this herd mentality, because quite often we don't lead individuals. We should, but we don't think of it that way. We often think about leading groups of people. And so we end up leading a herd and we forget about that individuality of each person. And so I just kind of, dealt with that, thought about it, put it as a part of my life. And so then as I went from role to role and industry to industry, everything was an opportunity for me to learn more and more. And so I ended up in this really strange space decades later, in which we had left the faith-based nonprofit. And the main reason is because it's nonprofit.
It's nonprofit. Sure.
They don't have money, right?
Yeah,
and we were burning out, and there was all this other stuff. And so I pulled together a group of my closest friends. They're like my advisory board. And I said, I want you to help me think through this. And one of them just, almost the cliche, if you could do anything in the world, what would you do? And I kind of blurted out, gosh, if I could be anything, I'd be a speaker. But what I'm really thinking, and before I could get, but what I'm really thinking out, the wheels were in motion. And 3 weeks later, I was in Bermuda opening for Les Brown. And from there, everything just mushroomed. And again, the engineer in me said, okay, now I have to learn this. So I had to learn the marketing, learn how to put together packages. But my content was solid because I'd had years of not only studying it, but living it.
Yeah. Wow. That 3 weeks, that's crazy, opening for Les Brown, one of the all-time great motivational speakers.
Yeah, there's a whole nother story behind that. If we have time later, I'll tell you that one.
Sure. Well, we have time now. I'd love to hear it.
Okay, so the deeper part of the story is, so when I said that, one of the person who actually asked me that question, he was in charge of 3 radio stations in Chicago. And he goes, well, geez, Les Brown speaks at my station every Sunday. let me call him. He tried to call him, couldn't get a hold of him. And then he said, man, if I had known this earlier, I'm doing an event in Bermuda. And I have Les Brown and 3 of his proteges speaking. Now, he was saying this because he had heard me speak hundreds of times, literally. So he knew I was good at what I was going to do. Mm-hmm. It was just doing it in another context. So he said that, and my closest friend, Roger, just looked at him and was like, really, Elroy? You to put him on stage? He's kind of challenging him, right? And so Elroy says, all right, I'll tell you what, I can't pay for you, but if you get there, I'll put you on stage. And so then Roger picked up his computer, because this was before we were doing a ton of smartphone stuff, and booked my ticket and said, now you have no excuses, go. And so I went. It was myself, 3 of Les's proteges and Les. It was fantastic. The main sponsor, Butterfield Bank, said we want to do another event, a full weekend, but we just want Tony and Les. We don't need the other people, just these 2. And that's how everything really kicked off.
Holy moly. Wow. That is like 0 to 100. 0 to 100, man. Wow.
Yeah, it's like starting a garage band and your first gig is opening for the Stones, you know?
Exactly. That's a great analogy.
What happened?
That's a great analogy. You talk, and again, you in your work, some in your writing, about disruption, and you're very intentional about that word. Tony, can you talk about how you view the difference between disruption and maybe the word change?
Sure. So they're actually 2 sides of the same coin, and they have a lot of the same dynamics. When we have change, we decide we're going to do something different. And so then we begin to make adjustments in our thoughts, our behaviors, our relationships, and hopefully whatever we wanted to change, changes, right?
Yeah.
Disruption is basically change backwards, as we used to say.
Okay.
Something happens and now we're playing catch up, right? And so it's unplanned, it's unsettling, it's still change, and it's still similar dynamics, but we feel like we've lost control. So on a personal side, changes, I'm going to lose weight. I'm going to get my finances together. I'm going to buy a house. Disruption is, I lost my job. My mom died, right? These are so unplanned, but now they've been thrown at you, the cards you dealt, and you've got to deal with it. So that's really the difference. And although they're similar, in many ways, they're a different monster.
Gotcha. In your book, you also speak the book, The Force Multiplier. Actually, let's just start right there. I think I have that like 3 questions down, and I really should have asked that first. Define a force multiplier. You use a military analogy for it, and if that's where it came from, maybe so. But what is a force multiplier?
Okay, so now we got to talk about a story. So
okay,
yeah. So I was with one of my closest friends, and we were really, really close. We're talking, he and I are close, our wives are close, our kids are close. So I was pretty devastated when I heard that he was about to be deployed to Afghanistan once again to serve, the United States. And so we decided to host a party at my house. And, we had about 30 to 40 of our closest friends, and we, ate and we drank and we laughed. And there was a period of time in which we went around the room and we all began to share. We shared how we're going to stay in touch with him as he's serving our country, how we're going to make sure that he's encouraged, how we're going to make sure that his wife and his 2 young children are taken care of, that they're safe, that their needs are met, all of these things. But as this is happening, there was one person I was waiting to hear from. It's a mutual friend of ours who's a high-ranking officer in the Army, and he had been to a number of what he coined these deployment parties before. So I knew he would say something interesting, but I wasn't prepared for what he'd say, because he started off with, you're what I call a force multiplier, because by your very presence, you bring out the best in everyone around you. And when I heard that, something clicked. Now, I knew the phrase force multiplier because it's really a term for a tool, right? A pulley, a lever, a hammer. Mm-hmm. You exert a certain amount of force, and this tool multiplies the force on whatever object you're trying to affect. But this was different because I had never heard of it used in terms of people, and especially in terms of leadership. But then something else clicked, because I thought, okay, wait, I travel the country talking about leadership. I've heard almost every definition of leadership. Leaders turn the ship, leaders set culture, leaders have followers, blah, 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 blah. But rarely had I heard someone say, because that leader is there, everyone is better. But then I thought, but isn't that the purpose of having a leader in the first place? Is that they're making everyone better. They're freeing everyone up. They're keeping everyone focused. And so I realized that should not be, some, stratospheric level of leadership. That should just be how we define leadership, right? And so that's really where I started with is I believe that the aim of a leader should be to be a force multiplier.
Got it. Love it. All right. So how does one become a force multiplier, or is one a force multiplier? I know you said earlier leadership is a learned skill, like the process and everything that you learned in chemical engineering, you applied that to people. Is becoming a force multiplier a learned, acquired skill?
I think it's more nurture than nature, right?
Okay.
I think that very few people are born leaders. There's more of a chance that someone in their life around them had that skill and transferred it to them, maybe a parent, a coach, a family member, a older or younger sibling, whatever. But very few people are just born with that. And even if they are, in some ways, being born with it can almost be a detriment because it keeps you from refining it. So I'm a bass player, okay? Yeah. I love playing bass guitar. But in some ways, so I started off playing trumpet. I had found out in 4th grade, I have a super high musical aptitude, okay? Like we tested and I tested like super high, almost off chart. And so I learned trumpet very quickly. So I picked up bass. I learned bass so quickly that I really didn't practice the way I should have. And there are certain fundamental skills I didn't pick up or I didn't learn because I kind of knew how to do things naturally. I could feel my way around songs. I remember actually later on in life, I said, I want to really learn how to read bass clef, read music and bass because I can read treble so easily. And I remember, I'll never forget, I was at a conservatory, I have this music teacher. She said, we're going to play the song, All the Things You Are, right? And, she'd give me the music before I'd practice it a little bit. We started playing it. And about 2/3 of the way through the song, she just goes, you're not reading the music. And I said, why do you say that? She goes, because there's no way you could play it that good and with this little knowledge of it. You're playing it right and it's flowing and it's not, but you're not reading the dots, right? And so sometimes talent ends up being a crutch and a detriment because it keeps you from refining that skill and sharpening the saw, as we so say.
Gotcha. No, makes sense. Makes total sense. If we jump back into your book, you quote it. There's authors you quote, and I think some research that people don't leave jobs, they leave managers. And I'm just going to dovetail into that because I think the very next page you write, or maybe the next chapter, whatever, you write 32% of workers are engaged. There's a lot to unpack right there. So people don't leave jobs, they leave managers, and only 32% of workers are engaged. So talk to that a little bit, if you will.
Yeah, I think the updated numbers may be like 34 or 36. It's still a third.
Sure, yeah.
You know what I mean? It's a third.
Yeah.
And that means 2/3 aren't. Okay, so that's the problem, right?
Yeah.
So I think we have to define engagement because I feel like most people can't define it, or when they try to define it, they really talk more about the characteristics of engagement. So the simple Tony-fied version of engagement is how much someone cares and what they do because they care. That to me is engagement. When you care, you go above and beyond the call of duty. You go the extra mile. You put your effort into it. You make sure your name is. All these things happen because you care. when you don't care, you do it. But I often say work is transactional, effort is personal. When you're not engaged, you work, but there's not the same effort as when you're engaged.
Yeah.
And so that's really what we're saying. And so then, almost every study will say the number one driver of engagement is a person's direct manager, right? So now you say, oh, wow, okay. Me being engaged has a lot to do with my relationship with my boss. And most people who are watching this podcast or listening to it or however they're ingesting this information, if you ask them, hey, have you ever had 3 great bosses in a row? They would look at you as though you're a unicorn. Like, what are you at? Okay, what about 2 great bosses? No, I've never seen, Bigfoot, right? It's kind of that thing.
Yeah.
And so now we're saying that's the problem.
Yeah.
That if people can't even say, I had a great boss, and your boss is the number one driver of why you care, then why should the workforce care?
Yeah.
So that's how it all plays together for me.
Man, I think I remember reading that in your book that, can you name, was there ever a time in your life when you were working where you had 3 great bosses in a row? I think you could survey a stadium full of people and not get one hand raised in that question, which is just sad. It's a sad state of affairs, but true.
Well, so the background story on this, the original title of the book was called Why I Hate My Job. Okay. Right. I still regret not doing that. I got talked out of it, but the idea was going to be like, why I hate my job. And there's going to be like a multiple choice thing below it. This could be, what I do, where I work for. There's going to be my boss, and there's going to be a check mark under my boss, right?
Yep.
When I tell people that, I'm writing a book called Why I Hate My Job, immediately they would flood me with stories of their experiences. And so then I'd ask them, well, have you ever had 2 good bosses in a row? And no one has ever said yes. Crazy.
So the question is so obvious. Why? Why not? Why don't they have 2 great bosses, let alone 3 in a row?
I think there's a number of reasons. Number one, most people, when they're put into leadership, it's done for the wrong reason, right? They're good contributors. And they're just like when I was a chemical engineer, there's skill sets that it takes for me to be an effective chemical engineer or a contributor of whatever you do. The minute that you become a supervisor, team lead, manager, whatever it is, it's a totally different set of skills that you now need, right? And yet we still rely on the old stuff that got us there instead of the things that it's going to take to be successful at our new role. So that's problem one.
Yep.
Problem number 2, most organizations do not invest enough money, resources, and time to developing effective leaders. So if you take someone who's now been promoted into this situation and you don't give them the necessary skills that it takes to be effective, that right there, those 2 things are a recipe for disaster. And then the third thing, and this is something that's not in the book, I've probably never said this publicly, but I have been thinking about this more and more and more and more the last few months. I think I say that, leadership magnifies your weaknesses, right?
Yep.
The same way that change and disruption magnify your weaknesses.
Yep.
But I realized the biggest weakness that is magnified when you become a leader are your insecurities. And most people lead out of insecurity.
Mm-hmm.
If you have children, there are times where, regardless of how you feel emotionally, physically, whatever, I have to do this because I'm the adult and they're the children, and this is what's best. But when you're not secure as a leader, that same thought pattern doesn't necessarily happen. And so people start leading out of anger, frustration, fear of competition, all of these other insecurities that really become a problem. And then where it really plays in is the fourth area. And this, I know I've never talked about publicly. I think there's a weird culture in leadership, and it's been there for years, and I've never heard anyone talk about it. But I believe that for many leaders, they believe they were promoted because they were better than the other people. Okay. Now, they may have been better at doing certain things than the other people, but they believe they're better. And that better begins to extrapolate to better people overall. And when you think you are a better person and you have any form of insecurity, it's easy to talk down to people. It's easy to look down upon people. And I see leaders getting incredibly frustrated because people don't just easily follow them.
Yeah.
And I was watching an interview with Mike Tomlin, the coach of the Steelers, right?
Yeah. He
said, this is gold. I mean, this is absolute gold. I think about it all the time. I just switch it over to management. But he said, I love it when coaches fight against the responsibility of coaching. And and you could take that to man. He's like, they complain about the people that they're coaching. Yeah. And the reality is, if everyone just did what you told them and were easy to lead, they wouldn't need coaches.
Yeah.
Right. And it's a funny thing because my wife and I used to do this in our jobs. And I actually had a group of friends, we would do this. It was just kind of a mind reframe. Whenever the people that we were leading, it just got stressful and difficult, we would just look at each other and go, job security. It's as long as they're acting this way, they need us. So job security, right? And I think that thinking about things that way is really helpful because, there is a vacuum of leaders today.
Yeah.
There really is. We need, and this is in corporate America, but I'm also talking to you entrepreneurs and business owners, because you stepped into this arena with a great idea, a great product, a great service. But now, if you don't become a great leader, you're the bottleneck in things happening. And so you're going to have to be able to build a team. My last year, 2023, as a business was not the year I wanted because I spent the entire year building infrastructure, expanding my team, bringing on trainers, and I had to get everybody. It was a lot of work. But now our capacity is so much more. We can take on so much greater clients because we did that work. But I know my leadership skills were tested last year.
Yeah.
My patience was tested last year, but it was critical. And so if you're in corporate America, or if you're a business owner or an entrepreneur or whatever, you've got to figure out this leadership thing. And it's not something that we do well naturally. Yeah. You have to understand that.
Yeah. Hey, everyone. As you know, I don't have any advertisements nor sponsorships on this podcast. My only ask of you, the listener, is that you share this podcast with someone that you know, a friend, a family member, a coworker, or a colleague who may benefit from this information, may benefit from today's guest, from the value that they're sharing with the audience, with you, the listener. When you share this podcast and our audience grows, it allows me to book more and more guests who have a great message, great nuggets of wisdom that you can benefit from, and again, your network can benefit from. So please, right now, push that share button, send it to somebody that you care about, and let's get back to the interview. You talk about getting outside, and people, they resist change. They resist, certainly disruption and getting out of their comfort zone. What's the biggest change you've had to make that forced you out of your comfort zone?
Yeah. So this goes back to early in our career path, right? So I'm a chemical engineer. I'm engaged to my wife. We're about to get married. Actually, we get married, and then 3 weeks after we were married, we were asked to leave our full-time jobs and step into this faith-based nonprofit, right? Now, I want us to consider everything I just said. 3 weeks after marriage, okay? We're like 2 weeks back from the honeymoon, a week and a half back from the honeymoon, right? Leave our corporate jobs and take a 67% cut in pay. Most, statistics are, many marriages end on financial reasons.
Sure.
It was a test of everything. But here's what I can tell you from all of that. That decision to step way outside of my comfort zone, and, if I could do it all over again, I would do it differently, without question. But the decision and all of the discomfort and the reality of the times where I thought, are we going to make it? And we made it through. It's made every other decision to step out of my comfort zone so much easier.
Yeah.
Because now it's not routine, but it's like, oh yeah, I can do this. So now it's funny in the midst, there's something called a stressor test. I don't know if you've ever seen it. I use it in some of my workshops. It's a test that actuaries use when you're applying for health insurance, life insurance, and ask you all these questions, in the last year, have you been divorced, a close family member died, blah, 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 right? Okay. So what they do is they take all of these events that have happened over the last year. There's a numerical value for each event that's occurred for you. And then they determine your risk levels, right? Okay. And for example, anything over 300, you have like an 80% chance of having a stress-related health issue, right? One of the big ones on there is moving, right? My wife and I, because I use this for some of my workshops, we were joking around. I said, I wonder what our stressor test looks like. And it was 462, okay? Like, we're walking coffins, okay? Sure. It's like, and then in the midst of it, we're like, we should move. I mean, it's like, you'd think we would be looking for stability, but we're in that. That does not mean that disruption doesn't throw us off, but we've built up our muscles and our tolerance so much for change, and we can see beyond the emotions and the stress of it. It allows us to make really good decisions because we needed to move to help take care of my family. It wasn't just like a random move. My parents were going through some health issues, and so we needed to move from New York to Michigan. But under the conditions, it seemed on paper like a bad move, but for us, we're like, we do this stuff all the time. Yeah. And so that really helped us a lot. I think for both of us, it gave us kind of a benchmark of, if we can handle that move, if we can handle that major change that we did at the beginning of our marriage, kind of handle anything. Yeah.
Yeah. That's awesome. Thanks for sharing that. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Explain to us, you have a concept that you talk about a lot, and actually it's a big part of your practice. Explain to us what unconscious bias is and really how it impacts us.
So unconscious bias, and I know I apologize for my lighting. So background, I live in Mexico now. So thought I'd throw that out, right? That's why I got a pool behind me if you can see it. So the light is changing constantly right now. But it's 85 degrees. I don't know what it's like wherever you are.
It's
but
cold. So I don't want to hear this. It's very cold here. Yeah.
Exactly. Okay. So unconscious bias is, unfortunately, because it's such a popular term, it is one of the most misunderstood terms around. Okay. Most people, when they think of unconscious bias, they think of prejudice and discrimination. Or they think of, racism, sexism, homophobia, et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. For everyone listening, I want you to rethink how you view the word bias. Bias is our decision-making algorithm. Now, you may not be familiar with algorithms, so let me give you a very simple example of an algorithm. A recipe. If you're going to make pound cake, you take a pound of butter, a pound of flour, a pound of sugar, and a pound of eggs, and you mix them together, and you get pound cake. Now, you can change the quantities and still make a cake. You can add milk, you can add vanilla, whatever. You can change the ingredients. Like I just said, milk, right? It's still make a cake, but it wouldn't be pound cake. So when you think of pound cake, if you think of traditional pound cake, you start to think of these very specific ingredients.
Okay.
It turns out that we do the same thing with people. We have thoughts about what does safe look like? What does trustworthy look like? What does smart look like? What does threatening look like? And we do it also in terms of positions. What do we expect a pilot to look like? Often it's what do we expect him to look like, right? Because that's kind of naturally what we picture. Yeah. What do we expect a physician to look and sound like? What do we expect an executive to look and sound like? There are ingredients that we expect to be in that recipe, and that is our biases.
Okay.
And so the way that starts to play in, I was trying to think, how do I explain this? So pizza, okay? Most people like pizza.
Sure.
But what's interesting is the big divide in pizza is one topping. Can you think of what that topping might be? Because people say, this should never be on pizza.
Is it pineapple?
Yes.
Okay.
Right? Now, I like pineapple on pizza. I like pork on pizza too. That's a big story, right? Okay. But it's, for some reason, you could put artichokes, so fish. You could put buffalo sauce, barbecue sauce, ranch. But for some reason, pineapple does not belong on pizza in some people's eyes, right? Yeah. We start to ask ourselves in different situations, what's our pineapple? So when we look at an executive, who in our mind do we think shouldn't be there? When we think of doctors, who shouldn't be there? We may not, and the thing is, we don't do that consciously, but we have expectations of what we're walking into. And when things differ from those expectations, it throws us off. And that's our unconscious biases.
It makes total sense. So how then, with your extensive research about diversity and unconscious bias, how is that playing out then in the workforce? How's that playing out in the professional setting then?
Sure. So the way it really works is, well, it plays in a few ways. One of the things is we're more comfortable with people who are like us. That's just natural, right? Sure. And so what ends up happening is managers hire people who they're comfortable with, often people who are like them. Now, that may be gender-wise, that may be racially, that may be ethnically, that may be age-wise. We talked for a moment before we got on here about personality. Sometimes it's they hire a personality that's similar to theirs, regardless of whether that's what's best for the role, right? If you're data-driven and you're, detail-oriented, but you're hiring someone for a marketing position, you might need someone with a different personality, but we often hire that person that we're comfortable with, okay? But then it plays out in far more traditional roles. Because we have expectations of what an executive should look like, a manager should look like, a salesperson should look like. When someone walks in the room and they interview, whether we know it or not, we immediately compare them with that expectation. And so if they don't fit that expectation, regardless of their qualification, it's much harder for them. We become more dismissive, right? If you remember years ago, there's a show, just like America's Got Talent, it's called Britain's Got Talent, right? Mm-hmm. And there's a woman who got on stage very famously, not very physically attractive. She didn't have the dress of a fashionista. She doesn't have the body of a supermodel. And you could see the look on the judge's face like, oh. But then when Susan Boyle started singing, people were blown away by her. But then no one went back and asked, so wait a second, why are we so surprised? We judged her on three things that have nothing to do with vocal quality: her looks, her dress, her body shape, right? But because she didn't fit that image of what they thought a great singer would be, they were surprised. And so then the same thing happens in work. And so that's why you start to have gender disparities, racial disparities, age disparities, sexual orientation disparities, because people don't fit the preconceived mold that others already had of that position.
thanks for that explanation, because that makes it makes complete sense, but it's also very easy to see how unconsciously we'll have those biases. Like you have to really focus on that. So is there, I'm sure this is probably the basis of your entire practice in business, but is there a tip, trick, something that we can do to recognize when we are doing that ourselves?
Yeah. And first, one of the things I think that's really important about unconscious bias is it's really unconscious. I mean, there are times we're biased and we're conscious of it, but the fact that it's really unconscious, I use this phrase all the time. I say, because of that, you cannot use bias as a barometer for morality. Because quite often people hear, oh, that person's biased, and then we immediately start to look at them differently. We demonize them. We say, and the truth is, if you're a human and you had any experiences of any type in life, you have some biases in your thinking processes. It's how the brain works. So once you do that and you start to understand that this is not a barometer for morality, it allows us to have conversations that maybe we wouldn't have in the past. And it allows us to start approaching subjects that have been very touchy, but now we can go, you know what, this is not going to be a blame thing, but we can talk about this in a way that's constructive and gives us some kind of a positive outcome. So that part of it's really important.
I'm glad you said that, because, we're recording this in 2024 and the world's a little sideways on, you got to be so politically correct and don't talk about that and don't talk about that and act like you don't see this. And man, you just gave permission to people to say, hey, let's enter into a dialogue. Let's open up this dialogue and talk about it. It's not a morality discussion. It's a let's understand each other more discussion.
Yeah. I mean, listen, the reality is that's why I get hired. Okay. Normally when I get hired, they tried to address this once and it didn't go well. I'm Mr. Wolf from Pulp Fiction, and I got to come and clean up the mess. Okay,
wolf.
That's what normally happens. So I have been, and this is the engineering. I really thought through the difference between what sounds good and what's effective, and I'm very pragmatic on this subject. And you would think, okay, well, Tony, clearly you are a Black male. You've got skin in the game. And that's very true, but that's not how I approach the subject. That's not part of the conversation. The conversation is about understanding how we think and understanding that the way we think can even be manipulated, right? Like it's scientifically proven that the way we look at data on a sunny day versus the way we look at data on a cloudy day is different. Okay. It's just kind of proven across the board. There's other things that are huge. We know that if you go to a car dealership, if you sit in a comfortable chair, once you start negotiating prices, you will end up paying about 15% higher than you would if you either stood up or sat on an uncomfortable chair, because there's a body-brain connection that we're not aware of. So when you start to hear all of this stuff, you go, oh, this is not a good or bad, or I'm a bad person, or this is a racist, sexist. We got to clear some of this stuff up. Now, some of the origins come from those things, right?
Sure.
And we've inputted them in because of our experiences in the world, okay? But we've got to say, okay, I want to be a good person, because I believe the vast majority of people want to be good, and they want their actions to match their values. And the reality is, the thing about unconscious bias is sometimes that we have a bias unconsciously that goes against what we consciously know to be good, moral, and right. And so it sabotages those efforts. And we go, oh, I thought I would respond better than I did. That's what we're talking about. So that's why the conversation's so important, but it's important for it. What happened in 2020 is because it became such a popular topic that people who are unqualified got chances to talk about it. Okay. It's like, I use weird references. Okay. It's like grunge in the mid 90s, right? Or late 90s, early 2000s, right? Once you got past Nirvana, Pearl Jam, Temple of the Dog, and Soundgarden, then it was like, hey, let's just sign all of these garage bands to $1 million contracts because it just became this, we're going to throw money at everyone who says they're grunge. That's the same things happened in this arena, is that they threw money at everybody, whether they were qualified or not. And so then people got bad experiences, are like, well, maybe the whole topic's bad, and it's not.
Yeah.
Right? So I know I went on my little soapbox on the side. This is one of the things that happens.
Only thing I would add to that is, of those four, I think you left out the fifth, which would be Alice in Chains. I think Alice in Chains deserves to be there.
Alice in Chains, absolutely. 100. But that's what happens when you're trying to do something off the top of your head, right?
Yeah, there we go.
Something, okay?
But
Temple of the Dog,
Seattle Five,
which most people would not have caught Temple of the Dog. Okay, I'm just going to say that.
Yep.
Okay. What can we do? A couple of things. The more you're aware that, okay, I could be biased. I'm probably going to be biased. I know I'm going to be biased in certain situations. The more you're aware of that, in those moments, you can stop. I use the acronym PAR: pause, assess, and respond. You pause for a moment. You breathe. You're giving a chance for you to not just respond subconsciously, but consciously. It's, I meet someone and I feel uncomfortable. Before I react, pause for a moment. Why do I feel uncomfortable? Right? Or I feel really comfortable around this person. That's almost more dangerous, because then we get taken advantage of, right? Yeah. So, especially business owners and entrepreneurs, we're taught, people are taught to be, be able to schmooze. So now you're talking to someone and all of a sudden you're willing to give them a contract. You're like, wait a second, why do I feel this way? Oh, they remind me of someone. Oh, it's the way they're dressed. Oh, they said this, which it's a trigger word, right? Now we can respond not only consciously, but logically instead of emotionally. So pausing, assessing, and responding is a great way to start that conversation of what can we do differently? Because you can reprogram some of your biases, which we end up talking about in our workshops, right?
Yeah.
But a lot of times what you're trying to do is make the unconscious conscious. So if you consciously are making that decision, that's different. But if you're unconsciously making it, then you've got all sorts of problems that are going on with
you. Yeah. Oh, it's very insightful. Very insightful.
Thank you.
So I'm going to ask you a question. You can't choose your own book because that would be cheating. So you can't choose the Force Multiplier, which I highly recommend to all the listeners. Is there a book that you've read? And again, I guess it'd be more germane to our conversation if it related to our conversation, obviously, around a book that you read that when you set it down, you thought about this topic, this unconscious bias and leadership and the need to lead an individual, not the herd. Is there a book and an author that you could recommend to the listeners that would augment what you've already written?
I'm going to give you an answer that I'm not going to say it augments it, but I think this has been an important book for me, and I need to explain why, because I think listeners are going to hear the title of the book and go, really? Okay. Think and Grow Rich by Napoleon Hill. Okay. Now, here's why. I was a scientist way before I was a scientist. Okay. I was probably a scientist by third grade. I knew I wanted to be a scientist of some sort. I thought scientifically. Everything was science for me. And so when I would hear things about, positively manifesting and all, I was like, this, I'm about to date myself. This is some Hare Krishna stuff, right? I mean, I'm not, come on, man. No. Okay. But what I started to realize based on a number of experiences that I've had is I had a lot of thinking issues that were holding me back. Okay. Now I'm recommending Think and Grow Rich, but for me, what made Think and Grow Rich work was I read a book called Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. Okay. That is the unconscious bias Bible. Okay. I'm telling you, it is, but I'm also telling you, it is a dense read, like really dense. He won a Nobel Prize for this stuff. Okay. But it's a dense read. It's very scientific. But what it did is it woke me up to the fact that for the average person, 90% of the decisions we make on a daily basis originate out of our subconscious. Okay, let me say it again. 90% of the decisions we make originate out of our subconscious. We don't realize it because then our conscious brain goes back and basically confirms it and says, yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking. But functional MRIs tell us very clearly where this originated from. So once that struck me, I knew I needed to reprogram a lot of the way I thought subconsciously. And so Think and Grow Rich, although it is not a perfect book, there are so many great strategies that I think are critical. In fact, my wife and I just reread it again over the holidays to prepare us for 2024. I think it's almost a must read for people.
Yeah, and that's what I've found with the great books, Think and Grow Rich, How to Win Friends and Influence People, like these classics that were written, 80, 90 years ago. You do need to revisit them every couple of years because you'll pull new nuggets out of them every time. Yeah.
Yeah.
So a couple last questions, and these are a little different but fun. And this one is not meant to be morbid by any means, not at all. But I'm sure you're going to live this long, beautiful, rich life. But at some point, you'll get to the end of your life, and let's fast forward to your funeral, and you're looking down from above, and a loved one is reading your eulogy, and that loved one can only choose 3 descriptors, 3 words that describe your life. What 3 words do you hope they choose to describe the life you lived?
Wow. 3 words. Okay. Good. I think it's more important to be good than it is to be great. Because great is often trying to get to a position, but right now there's a famine of just good people, or at least good people in the necessary positions we need in our society. So I think good would be the first word. The second word would be some form of giving, charitable, helpful, but not charitable is not right because it's not that, he's contributed to charities, but he's contributed to individual lives, right? So some form of giving. I want people to be able to share, here's how Tony helped me. So the word would be helped, somehow improving their lives. And then I can't think of how to say this in one word, so I'm going to semi-cheat here, but
sure.
Reached his potential.
Love it. That's great. I asked that question because it was asked of me one time, and it made me really think. Okay, those are my 3 words.
Great question.
Well, and then you realize, like, okay, every day I get up out of bed, that's what I should be striving for. When all the other crud's happening, let's forget it. These are the 3 things I should be striving for every day, right?
Yeah, I'm thinking about that already.
Second to last question. I give you a magic wand, and again, we're in 2024, and we both agree the world needs a lot better leadership. But I give you this magic wand, and you can wave it and make one change to the world as we know it. One material change. Like the world is different tomorrow morning when we wake up because you wave this magic wand. How is the world different according to Tony?
If I could wave my magic wand over the entire world, it would be to eliminate greed and fear. I think all the things that are going through my mind that I want this to change or this to change, they are all functions of primarily greed, but then sometimes fear.
Which are really two different sides of the same coin sometimes.
Exactly.
One drives the other. Probably, I think always one of the most important questions is, Tony, how can people, your book, The Force Multiplier, I bought it off Amazon. It's available where books are sold, but where can people follow you, contact you, get in touch with you, and just be part of your journey?
Yeah, appreciate that. So we're redesigning the website, but if you could spell my name in this day and age, which is CHAT as in Tom, MAN,
Yep.
you could find me, right? The website is really the central location. It gives you links to all my social media. We're upping my blogs, YouTube, but I'm on all social media platforms. I'm very active on them. Almost everything is Tony Chatman except for TikTok and Instagram, which are Tony Chatman Speaks, because someone already had Tony Chatman. So
gotcha.
That's it.
And so website, Tony Chatman, this is with the T, Chatman.com?
Yep, just one word, TonyChatman.com.
Perfect. We'll put that in the show notes so that people can just click right on it there when so they go to it. So, Tony, wonderful time with you, and just you're so thoughtful. Like you just think before you give an answer, because that's just who you are, and I really, really dig that. So I've enjoyed this time, and I really appreciate you coming on today.
Dude, Roger, thanks for having me. This was it's a fantastic conversation. I'm on a lot of podcasts, and you never know what you're walking into, but this has been an absolute delight. I appreciate it.
Oh my gosh, my pleasure. My pleasure. Yeah. Thank you for tuning in to the ThriveMore podcast. Don't forget to take a look at the show notes for any of the resources that we mentioned during the podcast. And if you haven't already, be sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on your notifications so you have access to the latest and the greatest. You can connect with me on any of the socials at Real Roger Martin. And be sure to check out our website, ThriveMoreBrands.com. There you'll find information on the brands we support and information on franchising. Thanks again for tuning in.